All right, folks, we're going to get started. Welcome to this installment of the Mind, Technology, and Society Seminar Series, MTS, the longest running seminar series here at UC Merced, brought to you by the Cognitive and Information Sciences Group and sponsored by the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts, with also a gift from the Glushko Samuelson Foundation. Today we have a special guest, the first of 3 speakers that we're going to have this semester that are co-hosted and co-sponsored by the Management Seminar Series. This adds to the eclectic and varied nature of our speaker lineup this semester. So I hope you enjoy the diversity that's coming. In order to tell you a little bit about the Management Seminar Series and to introduce our speaker for today, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Russ McBride, who's recently joined us here at UC Merced.
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure working with David, coordinating this stuff. Bernard is our second speaker that is in the Management Speaker Series. There's some overlap as we're coordinating some of the speakers. We've got Alberto Feduzzi next week on Tuesday is going to talk about decision theory, and then a lot of people that you folks might also be interested in trickling into the rest of the semester, including Brian Epstein, who's a philosopher at Tufts, Kirk Ludwig, who's giving a talk both here and on a Tuesday in our Management Speaker Series. He's doing a double header. And then Anton Howes is doing some history of innovation and lots of other stuff going on. So I encourage you to come to the Tuesday talks if they seem interesting and you have the time. I am delighted, genuinely delighted to have Bernard Reginster here from Brown University, where he is the chair of the philosophy department. I met Bernard over the summer, maybe it was September, when I was out there visiting and had just one of the best kind of lunch conversations I've ever had, which continued to today's lunch. We're also going to go out to dinner tonight. I think we've got a couple of extra dinner slots. If some of you want to join us, probably have maybe 3 more slots left. So come see me after the talk and coordinate, and you can join us tonight at the 510 Bistro. So I could continue, but I better stop. So I will let Bernard take the stage, and we're going to hear something about the spirit of entrepreneurship.
Well, thank you. Maybe you should wait after. So thank you very much for having me, David and Russ. I understand most of you are not working on entrepreneurship, which is great because it's a very sort of new or sort of tangential interest of mine. So I'm a neophyte. I'm very new to it, and hopefully I'll have some fresh things to say. But the slant of the material I'm going to present today is psychological, so it should be of interest to some of you, at least in cognitive science. But hopefully it's of general interest. So the title of my talk, The Spirit of Entrepreneurship, is inspired by the title of a famous essay called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that was written at the dawn of the 20th century by a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber. So it's a very, very classic essay. It's probably one of the most influential essays that was ever written on capitalism and capitalist culture in general. Now, in that essay, Weber makes a number of observations about capitalism, what explains its emergence, when and where it did, and so on and so forth. But he offers also a couple of insights that I found particularly striking. And both of those insights are contained in this little bit of text, which is from the essay. It says, it describes what motivates, if you will, a capitalist culture. And here's what he says. The acquisition of money and more money takes place here simultaneously with the strictest avoidance of all spontaneous enjoyment of it. Here, acquisition is no longer viewed as a means to the end of satisfying the substantive needs of life. It's the other way around. It becomes an end in itself. And this reversal constitutes just as surely a guiding principle of capitalism as incomprehension of this new situation characterizes all those who remain untouched by it. Okay. So the 2 insights that I want to emphasize here the first is based on a general claim that Weber makes in the claim. So he claims that for most of our human history, most of human history was governed by a model that he calls economic traditionalism. And this is the view that human beings, human communities are engaged in only as much economic activity as was necessary to produce the wealth that they thought was required to satisfy their needs as traditionally conceived. And that would be it. Capitalism, according to Weber, the distinctive feature of capitalism is it breaks free from economic traditionalism. Now you produce wealth, and then you produce much more wealth than your needs require, and you devote only so much of your wealth to the gratification of those needs, and then the rest of it you don't spend splurging on luxurious contingencies. On the contrary, you set that wealth aside as capital that you invest in further wealth-producing ventures and so on and so forth indefinitely. So that phenomenon, I'm going to call, this is not Weber's term, this is my term, I'm going to call the phenomenon of capitalist insatiability. What you have is an endless cycle of creation of wealth and then use of whatever of that wealth is left over once you have taken care of your subsistence needs as capital to fund the creation of further wealth. So that's the first insight. The second insight, of course, that Weber points out is that that's completely puzzling. Why would people do this? Okay, and of course, there's a lot of discussion about what would motivate human beings to engage in this endless cycle of wealth production, given that there's no prudential justification for it. You don't need it. So why would you want to do it in the first place? And of course, the initial answer that was given is that, well, it must be sort of an unbridled greed. Okay, and so this has given rise to a representation of capitalism that became famously enshrined in a character in a novel by the British novelist Charles Dickens, this fellow here, Mr. Scrooge, right? He's the guy who makes money, uses as little of it as possible to satisfy subsistence needs, and then uses the rest as capital to invest in new wealth-producing ventures, and so on and so forth, indefinitely. So this is going to be my question. Is the spirit that animates capitalism so understood? I mean, there are many other aspects to capitalism. I'm focusing just only on this aspect of what I call insatiability. Is the spirit animating it, in fact, unbridled greed? Now, why does that question matter? It matters because the ethical significance of capitalism depends upon this, right? If you can't justify capitalism in prudential terms, look, it gives us things that we need, then the question of why it's a good idea, ethically speaking, becomes a very important question. I'm not going to answer that question here. It would take us a lot more time, but I'm going to take a small step in the direction of answering the question, okay? By asking, well, how are we best to understand the spirit that animates capitalism? Okay. Now, Weber himself had an answer, right, which had to do with Protestant theology. Now, that answer is being criticized. I'm not going to talk about that answer here today. Instead, what I'm going to do, Weber is talking about, in his essay, the emergence of capitalism in the 17th century. I'm going to fast forward all the way to the 20th century. And I'm going to look at a body of literature that roughly span the second half of the 20th century, and I'm going to look at, and I think that there's an answer to our question there, but that's not made explicitly. It's there, it's sort of implicit. I'm just going to try to bring it out explicitly, okay? So, to understand what kind of answer that is, the first thing that we have to know is that there's a big change that takes place roughly around the middle of the 20th century in the thinking about capitalist culture. And the big change is done by this fellow. This handsome-looking fellow is an Austrian economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter. And he has written very influentially about capitalism, but the main claim for which he is best known is the claim that entrepreneurship is the engine of capitalism. What powers a capitalist economy, what powers the capitalist culture is entrepreneurship, right? I'm not going to read the passage, but that's basically what he says in that text. I mean, sometimes I'll have little quotes on the slides that I'm not going to read, and they're there so that you can see I'm not just making things up. Okay, so, all right. So now what's very interesting then, so people who were interested in studying capitalism then became very interested in studying entrepreneurship. Now what's very interesting is that they found in entrepreneurship an explanation for the phenomenon of what I have called capitalist insatiability. And the explanation is what I'm going to call here entrepreneurial insatiability. Okay? So here's what Schumpeter says. For example, a capitalist culture of entrepreneurial innovation is, as he puts it, essentially an evolutionary process. It's always on the move, so to speak, of what he famously calls creative destruction. Okay? So you create new stuff, it makes old stuff obsolete, and so it can be deemed to have destroyed it, and so on and so forth indefinitely. And that idea of insatiability becomes even more explicit, for example, in a book to which I'm going to refer a few times, by a psychologist named by the name of David McClelland, who in 1960 did a lot of work on the psychological profile of the entrepreneur or entrepreneurship, and he published his findings in a very influential book called The Achieving Society. And in that book he says, as soon as the entrepreneurial type solves one problem, he says, he loses interest in it, he must constantly be seeking novelty or new solutions to all problems. And then finally, this is another very influential, probably more popular book by a couple of our social scientists from, I believe, Michigan State University, called The Enterprising Man, which was published a few years after McClelland's book. And there they say the entrepreneurial type, he says, is apt to be perceived as a man who never rests content with past successes, but must ever strive anew for additional triumphs. Now, if you do a Google search on entrepreneurship, you're liable to find things like this, which basically builds this insatiability in the very nature of what it is to be an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur, what does it mean? Every finish line is only the beginning of a new race. Okay? The idea that you come to an end of something, then you want to go for the next, and so on and so forth indefinitely. Okay, so we want to understand capital insatiability. Now I have sort of reformulated the question as we want to understand what's entrepreneurial insatiability. Where is the point? Because you might say that the entrepreneurs are like that because they're also motivated by unbridled greed. Okay, but would that be correct? Would that be the best way of thinking about this? Is it in fact the way in which people have been thinking about this? Okay. Now, since I'm going to talk about entrepreneurship, I have to give you a sense of what that is. Okay, and here I'm walking into quicksand. Because over the past 15 years or so, there's been an enormous amount of dispute over the very definition of what entrepreneurship is. Okay. So Ralph has started, for example, to chime in that conversation. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to give you a view. I'm not going to defend it, but number one, I think that view still has quite a bit of traction, number one. And number two, that is in any event the view that was predominant in the literature that I'm going to look at. So basically what happened in the thinking of capitalist entrepreneurship roughly during the second half of the 20th century up to the beginning of this one. Okay? And the idea here is that you define entrepreneurship in terms of innovation. I mean, if there's a commonplace, that is it, right? Let me give you a few examples. This is Schumpeter. In a book that came before the book I mentioned earlier, he says, entrepreneurs are innovators who use a process of shattering the status quo of the existing products and services to set up new products and new services. Okay. And then McClelland, same thing, a businessman who does not innovate but simply behaves in traditional ways is not, strictly speaking, an entrepreneur as normally defined. And then much closer to our own time, Peter Drucker, who has written a lot about this, is very explicit as well. Entrepreneurs innovate. Innovation is the specific instrument of entrepreneurship. So this is, you look, again, you Google entrepreneurship, you're going to find innovation at every turn. Now the question is, and this is, in fact, I think where some of the dispute over the definition of entrepreneurship takes place, is the question of what it is to innovate. So here, I found it very interesting to think of it in the way in which Peter Drucker thinks of it. So innovation, as I'm going to understand it, is to create economic values, or to create a certain kind of economic value in circumstances in which that type of economic value didn't previously exist. Okay? So this is, for example, Drucker. So innovation is the act that endows resources with a new capacity to create wealth. Innovation, in fact, creates a resource, where a resource is something that has value for us, that we can use. There's no such thing as a resource until man finds use for something in nature and therefore endows it with economic value. Until then, every plant is a weed and every mineral is just another rock. Okay? So turning what's a weed or what's raw material into something that has economic value for us, into a resource, is the act of innovation. Now, Drucker himself distinguishes between two broad categories of this. One is the basic form of innovation is that you start with a raw material and then you turn it into something that has economic value. Okay? And to illustrate this, I found this really cool little picture. I don't know if you can see it very well. Oh, on the top of the picture, this is Manhattan as it was hundreds or maybe thousands of years ago. And on the bottom of the picture, this is Manhattan as it is today. So you start off with the raw nature, and then you turn it into something that has economic value. Okay? And then the second form of innovation is to combine existing resources. So to combine things that already have some kind of economic value, some kind of usefulness for us, but to combine them into something that is going to produce new economic value. So here's a good example. I don't know if you can see it very well. This is an assembly line for cars, but with robots. So you combine two existing resources, automotive technology, robotic technology. You bring them together. You build better cars, faster, more efficiently, and so on and so forth, and for less money, and so on and so forth. Okay. So this is another form of innovation. Okay. So not every innovator is to go into the wild, into the jungle, and then turn it into something. Right? Okay. Now here's one issue that has been debated about innovation. It is the question of whether innovation involves the creation of something new that didn't exist before. And there's a tendency, and the tendency was very popular, especially in the Reagan era, the 80s and early 90s, according to which, this is the epitome of the entrepreneur. Steve Jobs introducing the cell phone. Now that's completely, I've never seen this before. People were just, my God, look, and you put your finger on top of it, it's amazing. So, now a little parenthesis here. Do you know when this happened? When the iPhone was introduced? 2007. It's been less than 10 years. Can you believe this? It's amazing. I just wanted to point this out. Okay, so sometimes innovation is going to create something new. A new product, a new way of producing a product, a new market, a new form of our corporate organization, and so on and so forth. But not always. Let me give you two examples of what clearly qualifies as innovation, creation of economic value where none existed before, without its counted really as, without involving the production of novelty. Here's one example, generic drugs. Okay, bringing a generic drug to market. You don't invent the drug is already there. The chemical discovery has already been made, all the testing work and so on and so forth. You simply take it, you buy the patent, you produce a cheaper generic version, you bring it to market. Okay, so that's additionally arguably counts as innovation, production of economic value with the known, but that doesn't involve novelty. Here's another interesting example. Right? I don't know if you can see this very well. These are a couple of three guys, probably in some poor slum in India, and they set up a TV repair shop. Okay? There's nothing new there, but it counts as innovation because what they managed to do is to come into a situation and create something that has economic value in a situation where that economic value didn't previously exist. Okay? And I think that we would all agree that these guys there count as entrepreneurial. Okay? So innovation is not necessarily the production of something new, it's the creation of economic value in circumstances where the economic value didn't previously exist. Okay, this is how I'm going to understand it. Now, a quick additional thing is here. I'm going to follow Drucker. This is going to be important later on, I hope, by calling the virtue. This is the kind of capacity or sets of capacities that are required for innovation. I'm going to call this effectiveness. So the kind of competence that a person displays when they innovate, I'm going to call this effectiveness. And Drucker distinguishes that from efficiency. Now, efficiency is basically the quality of somebody who is very good at applying pre-existing procedures to produce a predefined product according to predetermined standards. The example that he gives is the efficient shoemaker. He applies techniques that are already there to do something that has already been described, designed, and according to standards that are already set. Okay? Effectiveness, by contrast, is the competence of the person who can discern, what kind of value can be derived out of what raw materials and how. and also defines what's going to count as good for the production of that kind of economic value. That's effectiveness. Okay? Now, a final little bit, entrepreneurship in that literature is also widely seen not as a position, but as a function. Okay? So it would be a mistake to think that being entrepreneurial is the characteristic of people who occupy a certain position, namely the position of entrepreneurs. Okay? No, according to the literature, lots and lots of people can be entrepreneurial. So you should think of entrepreneurship as an adjectival kind of term. Okay? So you can be an entrepreneurial employee, you can be an entrepreneurial manager, you can be an entrepreneurial human resources, you can be an entrepreneurial shareholder, and so on and so forth. Okay? What makes you entrepreneurial is that you try to produce economic values out of circumstances in which that value didn't exist. Okay? So that's innovation. Okay, that's what entrepreneurship is. Okay. Now, back to the literature that I mentioned before, right? So now what I want to do is to identify for you 3 characteristics that have been assigned to entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial individuals or the activity of entrepreneurship in that literature. The first concerns the connection between competence and profit. Okay? So the temptation here is to think, look, people, including entrepreneurs, are going to be interested in being competent only insofar as it allows them to make profit. Okay? In other words, it's because they are interested in profit, that they become interested in the competence that's necessary in order to make that profit. Okay? Well, it turns out in that literature that relation is switched over. Okay? So let me start with a passage from Schumpeter. Okay? So he says that, well, look, of course, the promises of wealth and destitution are going to motivate the entrepreneurial type. Okay? If you launch an enterprise, you want to make profit, and you don't want it to ruin you, obviously. Okay? But he says the promise of wealth or profit and the threat of destitution are not by themselves sufficient to motivate the entrepreneur. Okay? There's got to be other things. There's got to be an element of risk, an admixture of chance, and it has got to require you to engage in activities in which your abilities, your competence are going to be on display, and in which you're going to have to work hard. Activities that are going to be difficult in some way. Okay? So that's why you worry about threats, because you worry about the threat of destitution, because destitution, it's not that destitution as such is an issue for you, but because destitution would show you to be incompetent. And likewise, you want profit, but not profit as such, but insofar as profit would be evidence of your competence. Okay? Now, McLennan makes this very clear. He says, obviously, he says, no one would argue that these men had no interest in entrepreneurial times, could be women, of course, had no interest in profitability. That interest cannot be understood not in terms of the naive psychology of the profit motive, but in terms of a need for achievement, which is interested in profitability because it gives definite knowledge of how competent one is. So you want to make profit because profit will show how competent, effective an agent you are. Okay? That's the first point. The second point is that there's a connection between enterprise or entrepreneurship and difficulty. Okay? So, let me give you a few pieces of evidence. So here's Schumpeter, to undertake new things is difficult. If you want to engage in the business of innovation, it's always going to be difficult because the environment is going to resist. But to act with confidence beyond the range of familiar beacons, to overcome that resistance, require aptitudes that define the entrepreneurial function. What it is to be entrepreneurial is that you go for tasks that are going to be difficult. Another example of this, McLennan goes even further. He says that it's the fact that it's difficult that makes it appealing to the entrepreneur. The incentive value of the achievement is a positive function of the difficulty of the task. Okay? And then, this was really a kicker, if you look for the definition of enterprise in the Webster-Merriam dictionary, in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it defines it in terms of something that's difficult. So it's built into the language, the very definition of entrepreneurship or enterprise is that it's got to be difficult. Okay? There's got to be difficulty, there's got to be challenges. But if you look at the literature carefully, you're going to see it's not just any kind of difficulty. Okay? It's difficulties of a certain sort. And here there's two distinctions I want to draw. First, This is the kind of difficulty that makes the outcome of the enterprise uncertain. Okay? Like you have to write a poem or write an essay. You just don't know. That's difficult and you don't really know how it's going to turn out. Okay? That's crucial, right? So you can have activities or tasks that are difficult in the sense that there's a lot of moves, you need some kind of technical competence and the moves have to be made at the right time and so on and so forth. But if you just follow a procedure very closely, then the outcome is certain. That kind of difficulty is not what's characteristic of enterprise or entrepreneurship. Okay? The outcome must be uncertain. Now, of course, these outcomes can be uncertain in all kinds of ways. Okay? This is the second distinction I want to draw, is that the difficulty that's characteristic of entrepreneurship is the kind of difficulty that requires effectiveness. That is to say, creativity of some kind, not just efficient effort in order to be overcome. Okay, so look at this example. So you see this guy, this is probably Sisyphus, pulling this rock. No, this is a big rock. Okay, it's difficult in a way that makes the outcome of the enterprise uncertain. I mean, he may run out of steam before he gets to the top of the mountain, and then, what happens, right? So that's not the kind of difficulty, even though it's a difficulty that makes the outcome uncertain, that's of interest to the entrepreneur. Rather, the kind of difficulty that matters here is the kind of difficulty that requires effectiveness to be overcome. And what I have here, I don't know if you can see it very well, this is a manuscript from a score of, by Beethoven. Okay? So Beethoven was a notoriously creative composer in the sense that he broke free with the rules of classical harmony, for example. He was trying to develop a new form of musical language, which is difficult, right? And you can see how he struggled, how difficult it is here. But clearly, this is the kind of difficulty in order to overcome which, what you're going to need is some form of effective or creative effectiveness. Okay? So, difficulty is the second feature that I want you to highlight. And it's got to be understood in difficulty in that sense. Third feature, and that you must know too, enterprise. The entrepreneur is the person who takes risk, right? So here's again McClelland. The entrepreneurial role appears to call for decision-making under uncertainty. That's how he defines it. Okay. It's risky. And if there's no significant uncertainty, if the action it calls for involves applying a known procedure, no matter how difficult, that's not what the entrepreneur is about. Okay. And again, if you look at the popular representation of entrepreneurship, you can see that risk-taking is built into it. For example, here, I'm an entrepreneur, what does it mean? Well, one of the things it means is I take risks. Okay. And the risks that I take have something to do with the fact that I engage in tasks, the difficulty of which is going to require creative effectiveness to resolve. Okay? Now here too, the question is, what kind of risks? Right? Not just any kind of risk. Okay? So I'm going to draw two distinctions here. First distinction I'm going to draw is between what I'm going to call manageable risks and unmanageable risks. A manageable risk is essentially a risk that you can mitigate through the effectiveness of your own agency. And that distinction was first drawn by, of all people, Joseph Schumpeter. So he says, famously, the game of entrepreneurship is this. It's not like roulette, it's like poker. Okay? So what's the difference here? Well, in the case of roulette, you bet on, say, number 24, and there's a very low probability. There's a huge amount of risk. There's a low probability you're going to win, but there's nothing you can do to mitigate that risk. You just have to wait and leave it completely up to chance. By contrast, in the case of poker, you can mitigate it, right? So even if you get a bad hand at poker, if you're a skillful player, you can still win the game, okay? So he says that that's more like the risk that the entrepreneur likes, because this is the risk about which there's something he can or she can do. Okay? Okay, that's the first distinction. Second distinction, now it turns out that what's interesting is that both these risks here, poker and roulette, are risks that are more or less calculable. Okay? They are known probability models that tell you what chance you have to win if you bet on 24, and what, probably a little messier in the case of poker, but what chance you have to win if you get a certain hand in poker. Okay? But, actually, in the very early in the thinking of capitalism, another distinction was drawn between what I'm going to call calculable and incalculable risk. And that distinction was drawn by a fellow named Frank Knight in a book that appeared in 1921 called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And basically, what he calls risk, strictly speaking, is characteristic of a task whose outcome is uncertain, but where there's a probability model that allows you to calculate the chance of the outcome being a certain way. And what he called true uncertainty is characteristic of tasks where you cannot calculate the probability of the outcome. There's no existing probability model to do so. And what Knight argues...
But it is a subjective probability. You're confusing objective with subjective. So one is objective, risk is objective, uncertainty is subjective. Knight and uncertainty is about subjective probability. So there is a probability, but it is subjective.
Even for true uncertainty?
For uncertainty, yes. So I can assign probability, a probability that it will rain tomorrow.
Oh yeah, sorry.
We're going to have different probabilities.
Yeah. Sorry, I was being unclear. So that's right. There's a probability, an objective probability for everything. After all, there's probably for everything that happens in the world. There's an objective probability, to be sure. But there's no probability model. I mean, so there's no way for us.
No objective frequency probability.
That's right.
Objective probability is a frequency.
Thank you. You're right. That's right. I should have made this more clear. So this is why Knight thinks that entrepreneurial innovation very often is going to involve true uncertainty, precisely because, so for example, if you're trying to create a new product, you don't know how people are going to respond to it. You cannot calculate what the probability of people being interested in, because it's never been there before. So you don't have any data to form a probability model. Yeah. So these are the two distinctions that were drawn here. So we have three characteristics, Our competence and profit matters insofar as it is an indication of competence. There's got to be a certain form of difficulty, and attendant to the difficulty there's going to be a certain element of risk. That is to say that you're not going to be able to determine for certain how successful you're going to be. Okay? All right. Now I turn to the way in which in the literature entrepreneurial activity was depicted, was described. And now you're going to see that there's going to be terminology that has a kind of evaluative connotation. Okay? So the first thing so there's two conceptions of what the spirit of entrepreneurship is that have a kind of bearing on the way in which you might want to evaluate it. The first is a term that's introduced by Schumpeter. So in this famous 1942 book, Schumpeter has a description of the entrepreneur, which was very, very influential, which covers basically a page and a half, and in that 1 page and a half, he describes entrepreneurial activity twice as an adventure, and even uses the term romance once. Okay? So this first idea. Then you look at McLelland, and McLelland is going to emphasize the idea of achievement. Clearly, where the term achievement is meant to designate something of value. Okay? You don't describe something as an achievement unless you think that this is a good thing in some way. Now, in each case, there's a distinctive value, but what's the value that's supposed to be captured by the terms adventure and the term achievement? Okay. But first, if you think of it, very, very briefly, adventure is appealing because of the promise of stimulation. The promise that you're going to be, you're going to be drawn and absorbed in an experience or activity. The promise that you're not going to be involved in something routine and boring. Okay? That's one. In the case of achievement, the hallmark of achievement is going to be, what's valuable about it, is going to have something to do with the demonstration of competence. Now let me explain this to you. The sole fact that you achieve your goal doesn't necessarily make it an achievement. Okay? Why? Because you might have lucked into it. Okay? You might have, I don't know, you might have fallen backward into money, something like that. Okay? So what makes the realization of your goal an achievement is not just the fact that it was realized, but the fact that the realization of that goal required the effective exercise of your agency. And how, so in other words, that it was evidence of your competence. Okay? If I discover completely by chance a cure for cancer, I'm not going to think, and nor should you, of this as an achievement. But if my discovery of a cure for cancer is a demonstration of my competence as a medical researcher, then I'm going to see it as an achievement. Okay? So what the value that is denoted by calling something an achievement is the fact that it involved the exercise of competent or effective agency. Okay. Now here's the thing, right? Difficulty and risk, which we have been talking about, are essential both to adventure and to achievement, but they are essential in different ways. Okay? So they play different roles in each. So in the case of absorption in an activity, adventure, the reason why it's got to be a bit difficult, the task that you set for yourself, the enterprise in which you're engaged is going to be a bit difficult, is because it's only if it's a bit difficult that it's going to concentrate your attention and absorb you in it. Okay? And the difficulty has to be optimal. So for example, the psychologist Mihaly has done all kinds of research about this. If it's too difficult, it's going to make you anxious and it's going to alienate you from it. And if it's not difficult enough, you're going to grow bored and you're going to lose concentration. Okay? But it's got to be the case that you set yourself an objective that the difficulty of which exceeds optimally your level of competence. So that what you have to do is to raise your level of competence in order to be able to meet the objective. Now, in the case of achievement or the demonstration of competence, difficulty is also important, but it's important in a different way, right? Here's how. How do I know that my success at achieving, at realizing a goal counts as an achievement? How do I know that it is the product of the competent or effective exercise of my agency? Well, at least, not only, but at least if, and there's a lot of people who think that, at least if I had to confront and overcome difficulty on my way to realizing that achievement. Okay? Otherwise, if there was no difficulty at all, I may say that, but the reason why my goal got realized was the luck or the product of a cooperating environment, but it has nothing to do with my competent agency. So there's got to be some level of difficulty to give me the sense that my success, which involved my, finding a way to overcome the difficulty, was the product of my agency and therefore an achievement. So for example, this young philosopher by the name of Gwen Bradford was written a whole book about this idea. But these ideas that you already find in the 19th century. Okay, so what you have here is a bit of a problem. You have these different views, but they're not the same. So the desire to have adventures, to be stimulated in that way, to be absorbed in activities, is not exactly the same as the desire to demonstrate competence. Okay? So you have a bit of a, well, which is it? Well, it turns out it's both. Okay? And you can see that it's both if you go back, I'm going to do a quick jump back to the 19th century, and the way in which entrepreneurial activity was defined or was understood then. Okay? And I'm going to start with a quote from the American philosopher Ralph Emerson. He has written a very influential, actually he's written two, but he's written influential essays on wealth. And here's what he says about wealth. Men of sense, he says, esteem wealth to be the assimilation of nature to themselves, the converting of the sap and juices of the planet to the incarnation and nutriment of their design. Power is what they want. Power to execute their design, power to give legs and feet, form and actually to do their thought. Okay? So he says, look, again, wealth doesn't matter for itself, but only insofar as it is evidence of capacity. Now that idea that was then picked up by a famous German philosopher in the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, in his concept, much misunderstood concept of the will to power. So what does he mean by that concept? So what he's identifying here is a special kind of motivation, or a special kind of a spirit that might be driving a certain kind of activity. Now what is the will to power? Well, in a nutshell, there's a few characteristics that I want to highlight. First, to want power is simply to want to make the world conform to my will. That is to say, to transform it into something that has value for me. Okay? So you can see the echoes of Drucker's concept of innovation. Okay? You transform raw materials into something that has value for you. Okay? Now, number two, and this is very important, conformity of the will of the world to my will counts as power in Nietzsche's sense only if it is a product of the exercise, the effective exercise of my agency, only if it's an achievement. So the power that I have over the world, when it conforms to my will, counts as power only if that conformity is the product of my power to make the world conform to my will. Let me give you an example, right? So with one notable exception, when Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, they lived in a world that largely conformed to their will. They were hungry, there was a low-hanging ripe fruit, the temperature was perfect, they didn't even have to wear clothes, and so on and so forth, right? But as eventually became painfully evident to them, they didn't have power or mastery over that world, okay? Why? Because its conformity to their will was not a product of their agency, or something that their agency was capable of maintaining. It was all God's, okay? So the conformity of world to will matters not as such, but insofar as it is evidence of effective agency. So that at the end of the day, the concept of will to power is best understood as a drive or a motivation to possess effective agency. With that agency, remember, has got to be creative in some way, because it's a matter of imposing, because imposing my will on the world is a matter, again, of discerning what value I can derive from what raw materials and how. That's creative. That's not applying pre-existing procedures or techniques. You have to make things up as you go along, okay? That's the will to power as Nietzsche understands it. The ability, the desire to have, possess creative effectiveness as an agent, so that you can actually transform the world and bend it to your will. Now it turns out that this idea then became the object of a proliferation of empirical research at the beginning of the 20th century, where people started to identify, you know, for example, a drive towards mastery, or something that was also later called a competence motivation, or to use a particularly ugly word, effectance motivation. The motivation to be, or the drive towards being an effective agent, okay? Where effectiveness is to be understood as creative effectiveness, as repetitive, okay? All right, now, that particular drive had a special character. So there was, you know, floating about at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, what I'm going to call the orthodox conception of drive, which was basically formulated by Freud. And that conception of drive is the following, is as follows. A drive is a kind of a motivation that is aroused by the stimulation that's caused by a physiological need that has gone unmet. That stimulation is experienced as unpleasant, and it motivates the agent or the organism, depending on what you're talking about, to engage in a kind of consummatory activity towards the world that is designed to eliminate the unpleasant stimulation. And the paradigm of a drive for Freud and for the people was hunger. So your blood glucose level falls below a certain threshold, so you have a physiological need that goes unmet. That elicits an unpleasant sensation, you know, bad feeling in the pit of your stomach, maybe wooziness. And that motivates you to engage in a kind of commerce with the world that's designed to eliminate the sensation, to make it go away, typically by eating food. Okay? So on this view of drive, if you suppose, as Freud did, that all human activity is motivated by drives, and that all drives answer to that model, then you have to say that all human activity aims at the elimination of stimulation, because stimulation is always experienced as unpleasant in this view. But then, psychologists, I mean, following maybe Nietzsche's lead or the lead of others, started to identify forms of activity that seem designed not to eliminate, but on the contrary, to perpetuate or to reproduce the stimulation. And there were two such activities that were singled out. The first is activities having to do with inquiry, exploration, experimentation, activities that are generally going to be described as manifestations of curiosity. Okay, now I want you to think about curiosity for 1 second, and what it feels like, what satisfies it, what frustrates it, and so on and so forth. If you do that, you're going to note that curiosity is paradoxical. It's paradoxical because obviously it's not going to be satisfied unless you gain knowledge or understanding of the object of your curiosity. But here's the kicker: gaining knowledge or understanding of your curiosity does not leave your curiosity satisfied, just like when you find food, your hunger is sated. On the contrary, it leaves your curiosity in a state of kind of motivational restlessness. Okay? As if gaining knowledge, which is what you want, was always something that you didn't want. That's the paradox, right? So it looks as though curiosity is a desire for knowledge. Obviously, your curiosity is not going to be satisfied if you don't get knowledge of what you're curious about, but also resistance for knowledge. The problems, mysteries, uncertainties that stimulate your curiosity. And then one way to think about what curiosity is for then is to think that it's best understood as a desire not just for knowledge, but for the activity of seeking knowledge, inquiry. Okay. So basically, those psychologists started to realize, oh no, but we have those motivations that seek not just, that motivate us not to achieve a certain state, but to engage in certain kinds of activities. When's the paradoxical character of those motivations? Now, what's true of curiosity here is also true of another type of activity that was identified as having the same structure, which is the activities that are motivated by the drive towards effective agents. Okay? So the successful realization of my ends, for somebody animated by this will to power, this competence motivation, leaves my drive towards effective agency both satisfied and unsatisfied. Okay? It's as if it's a desire both for the realization of my end and for resistance to this realization. That resistance which is going to provide opportunities for creative achievement, so that it's best understood as a desire not to achieve a certain end, you know, which is the end of a certain state in which my ends are realized, but the desire to engage in certain type of activity, creative activity. Okay? So if you look at those little boys, you can see that, you know, once they are finished building their little blocks there, they're going to be proud, they're going to be happy, but they're also going to think, okay, let's just blow it down now and do another one, right? Because there's something intrinsically valuable in the activity itself on making things, creating things, building things, okay? All right, so now I'm in a way to give you, I'm going to give you not one, but two possible explanations for entrepreneurial activity, for entrepreneurial insatiability that have nothing to do with greed. Okay? So let me start with the concept of insatiability, right? Insatiability, the desire is insatiable if nothing is ever good enough to satisfy it. Okay? So you might think that the desire towards wealth creation is insatiable in the sense that it can never be satisfied once and for all. Okay, that's insatiability. Now, the question is how we to understand insatiability. Right? Here's one way. Right? I'm going to call it the ordinary view of insatiability, because I think that's the view that will pop into people's mind most quickly. The ordinary view of insatiability is that you want something, and then you get an instant of that thing, but somehow you think that that instance is not good enough, or soon becomes not good enough, so that you want more of that thing. Okay? And there are two possible explanations for this phenomenon of insatiability or insatiable desires. Right? One is the phenomenon of psychological adaptation. Right? So the psychological adaptation is this: you have an experience that you have never had before that procures or that gives you a sense of satisfaction that you didn't have before. If that experience becomes customary, if you become used to it, it loses its ability to give you that satisfaction. Okay? Another possibility, of course, for it is that in some cases desires are for objects that I'm going to call essentially perfectible objects. That is to say, objects of which having more is always better and of which there's always more to have. Okay. Now, ordinary greed, I think, is very often understood in terms of this ordinary view of insatiability, right? And it's because, and there are reasons for that. One is that, as you probably know, adaptation to wealth, psychological adaptation to wealth, is extraordinarily rapid. Okay. So, for example, there's this research done by this fellow Brickman and his colleagues about lottery winners, for example. Okay. So, suppose you win $250 million in the lottery. You're going to think, oh, great, you know. Now, it turns out that the happiness level, as reported by those people, returns to what it was before they won the $200 million within a year. Within a year, they are back to where they were. Okay, that's adaptation, very quick to wealth. And of course, some people think that wealth is essentially perfectible, in the sense that it's the kind of thing of which there's always more to have, and of which it's always better to have more. Okay. All right. Now, this is the insatiability of greed. What is the insatiability involved in entrepreneurial activity? So first, I want to introduce you to another idea by Mr. Nietzsche, which is a different form of insatiability. So what he says is that, to be motivated by what he calls the will to power, this drive towards creative effectiveness, is to take joy in the destruction of what's good, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the idea here is that what motivates the insatiability is not the sense that what you have gotten wasn't good enough. What motivates the insatiability of the entrepreneur who has created, who has achieved something in business, is not that the achievement was not good enough and can be improved upon. In fact, the achievement can be as good as it can be. It can be perfect in its own terms, so to speak. So according to Nietzsche's view of insatiability, that the not good enough view of insatiability is not the insatiability that characterizes people with this kind of motivation. What is it then? And I think that there are two possible explanations. How am I doing? Almost finished, good. Explanation number one, right? The desire for effective agency is a desire for creative activity, or for achieving, rather than achievement. Okay? So, but here's the thing, right? You don't engage in an activity of achieving unless you actually achieve. But the problem is that your achievement puts an end to that part of creative activity. So that once you have achieved, if what you're interested in is the activity itself, you will want to find another opportunity for engaging in achieving activity. Okay? Let me show you. The desire for creative activities is what motivates the quest for new creative opportunities. Not that your achievement is not good enough. It can be as good as such an achievement could be. The reason why you're not satisfied, you don't settle with it, is because what you want is to engage in the activity of achieving. Okay. So this is why Mr. McLennan here calls his book not the Achievement Society, but the Achieving Society. Okay. So that's the first explanation. Okay. The spirit of enterprise takes the form of a drive or a motivation to engage in certain kinds of activities. Okay. And that's why achievements, actual achievements, are not going to leave, they're going to be satisfying with her because he's going to demonstrate to him that he was in fact, or that she was in fact engaged in an entrepreneurial activity, or in an achieving activity, but they're also at the same time going to leave her unsatisfied because, no, there's nothing else to do. Okay? That we look for something else. That's explanation number one. And it's based on the character of the motivation itself. Explanation number two has something to do with the object of the motivation. Okay. And the object of motivation is a drive towards creative effectiveness. Now here's the thing about creative effectiveness. Creative effectiveness is a quality or a competence that you can never be said to possess once and for all. Okay? This, in fact, is different from efficiency. So suppose that you are a shoemaker, and you have made shoes thousands of times before, and you're about to try to make yet another pair of shoes. Maybe you can have, in a moment of self-doubt, you may think, well, am I going to be able to do that? Well, for the person in that situation, he can take comfort in the fact that he has efficiently produced shoes thousands of times before. He can find comfort in that thought. It can reassure him, and he can confidently go into the business of building some more shoes. Okay? Because his efficiency has been demonstrated over the thousands of times he has built shoes, right? He has mastered the techniques and so on and so forth. Not so with effectiveness. That's not the kind of competence that can be said that we can be said to possess once and for all. Why is that? Well, because if you are, say, a venture capitalist and you set up a new business, it's going to be in very particular circumstances. It's going to require using very particular resources, very particular qualities, very particular forms of intelligence, and so on and so forth. So once you're done with that, if you want to go to a different business, you can be sure that the qualities, the creative qualities that allowed you to build the first business are going to be applicable to the building of the new business. And since no two situations, especially in the business of innovation, are ever the same, you can never take comfort in the fact that you have been creative before to know that you're going to be creative again. So to demonstrate that, I want to introduce you to a friend of my daughter's. This is Fancy Nancy. Okay, so Fancy Nancy is a very creative little girl, and she has been tasked, well, she and her classmates have been tasked by her teacher, Miss Glass, to write a poem, okay? And she has a writer's block. She's not sure, she's really anxious. Am I going to be able to write a poem? I don't know, right. You may have been in that situation before. And the teacher says, oh, you're a creative little girl, I'm sure you'll find something, right? And Fancy Nancy, who is wise beyond her age, and much wiser than the teacher in this, thinks to herself, I'm not so sure about that. Okay. So the anxiety that she exemplifies here is the anxiety about effectiveness. Okay. The fact that you have been effective before doesn't mean that you're going to be effective, creatively effective again. Right? So the desire for effectiveness in this way can never be satisfied once and for all. You can never reach a point where you can say, oh, I'm an effective agent, I'm a creatively effective agent. This is why you need to, to test yourself again and again. Right? And Peter Drucker makes the same thing. Working on the right things is what makes work effective, but you can't measure this by any of the yardsticks of efficient work. Okay. So success in one case doesn't necessarily transpose into success in another case. This is why you can never be sure. This is why the desire for it cannot be satisfied once and for all. I'm done. Thank you.